You going down there with your parents? What? You going down there with your parents? We are. Have they ever gone before? No. I'd like to see your dad's reaction. I can't wait.
Where are you going?
Wrigley first Monday. The trading post. Trade day starts.
Hey, look.
The crowd may be small.
You know,
The crowd may be smaller.
Yeah.
just dancers everything.
Did you have any questions?
Yeah. Me and Chris. And I thought that I was supposed to separate solace from me. So I did. It was really supposed to be solace from me. Because not that they cut up, but they talk. You know, it's like I would stand right there pointing. But you're moving away from me, I'm putting my mouth.
It doesn't matter. He'll talk to anybody. Doesn't matter if you're a complete stranger.
And he was trying to
I
tell
have one
about
like that.
some crap.
I have one like that.
Where they went, y'all went somewhere.
It's Washington. Yeah.
And it's something about some crabs. And he was the only one that found. I was the only one that found a lot of crabs. Even my brother. They did nothing. I don't know.
Yeah, we would, like that'd be shore crabs, you would stick the rock, and they would scatter like spiders, like moonshine. He thought that was a blast.
He really thought he is. He was one. Yeah, he was one. Everybody else couldn't do it.
I'm not so sure about that part.
I mean, something about him being the youngest and everybody else can do everything. You know, I did.
I'm not surprised about him talking to everybody. Probably doesn't matter who you separate from, whoever he's next to.
He was fun. If you look at that first time, that's not true.
Yeah,
I talked to the USDA guy.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get a animal property. Show them raise just prove it. Some bait, put some bait out there.
He probably remembers everything too.
That's actually helpful.
Pick them up. We got.
Are you bringing this back for us?
Do we have anything of yours before you go? Yeah, good to know.
Just put it, make sure it all sounds good.
I don't even know. Have you almost to the house yet? You like getting ready for some March. Targets aren't everywhere. She's here tonight. She's sitting in nursery class tonight, I think. It's Jackie's daughter, and my mom was in the house.
We're paying for it right now. That's kind of like what we did.
No point in painting it with kids. We haven't even bought a new couch. We need a couch. We needed a couch for like 10 years. And our couch is maybe like 4 homes ago. Never any time with us.
Somebody bought it with a couch. And I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah, like there's no sense.
We're just going to yell at them all the time.
We'll get nice things when they're gone.
I thought that was the plan. Just hold out.
I mean, at some point, somebody here will have a nice new couch. If it's not completely broken. So it is time to start, I guess. All right, it's 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Before we get started, one of our visitors, Harry, will lead us in a word of prayer. to get started. Let's pray.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have once again in the middle of the week to be able to come and worship you and study your word. As we do so, that we're able to take the lessons that we learn, spread your gospel throughout the world, and bring more to your fold. Pray as we study this book of Esther, we might remember lessons from it and be able to hopefully understand how great your providence is, and that we may not understand it, but that we know that you're always there with us and always by our side. Heavenly Father, that you do with all the members of this congregation, that we all may remain faithful, and that if anybody is facing physical hardships, that they may be able to overcome them and be with the doctors that oversee them. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
That's great. So tonight we're transitioning into the book of Esther. So we've gone through Ezra, we've gone through Nehemiah, and we're going to kind of go back in time to Esther. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline here in a second. So there are about 10 chapters in Esther, and we have 4 classes, 4 weeks on Esther. So do the math on that real quick. How many chapters a week are we going to cover? Not a whole lot, right? So this week we're going to cover 2 chapters. Not only that, you got me 3 weeks in a row because the slides are gone for a couple weeks. So we're gonna do a few little different things maybe this week, next week, to kind of fill in some space. The book leaves some holes, and to have full 2 classes on 2 chapters of Esther, I think is a little bit of a stretch. As John and I kind of looked over the material, we had to bend it a little bit. So what I want to do tonight is kind of do more of an introduction, a little bit of historical background to the book of Esther. But before getting into that, I wanted to just ask you all, like, when you thought you were going to study the book of Esther, what came to mind? What were some of the things that were on your mind that just natural reaction?
Haven't looked at it in a long time.
It's been a while, right? It's been a while. But you probably know the story, right? You know the basics of the story. What else?
Saw it in a play.
Saw it in a play? Was it accurate?
Yeah, pretty close.
Pretty close? Yeah.
I always think of the phrase "for such a time as this."
Mm-hmm. It's probably the most, famous, if you will, memorable passage. And I think there's something to that. It's an important message. I see the deep breath. Daniel?
I'm just out of breath.
It's like you're about ready to say something. What words of wisdom have got to come out?
No, not at all.
I just love the turnabout in the story, the plot twist at the end, and just, this is, an amazing thing how God took care of his people and, used the one who was against the Jewish people, used it against the antagonists. That was pretty interesting story.
Yeah, a little high stakes as well, right?
Yeah.
It was a risky situation. Could have gone either way. Yep. Anything else? Top of mind?
Mordecai, it's called Esther, but it's almost more about Mordecai. He's kind of the one prodding all along.
A little bit of the puppet master behind the scenes, maybe, Yeah, kind of running the show.
One of the few books that never mentions God.
Yeah, that's a key point. God's not mentioned, but can you see him in here? Yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful things. You don't have to mention God. It's an application for today. You may not have to mention God and how you go about your daily life, but people should see God in us, in each one of you all, right? What else?
I can still remember in high school, it was looked at as a piece of literature, and we studied it in public high school.
Wow. That was a long time ago, I bet.
I know.
I'm supposed to say that.
I will. She can't hit me while I'm up here.
John seemed like a good novel. I mean, once I started reading this, I couldn't put it down.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, you go through it pretty quick. I mean, it kind of leaves you hanging at, okay, well, now what's going to happen? Now what's going to happen? Now what's going to happen? Yeah. So, from my perspective, it's a historical book also. You know, so we're going to talk a little bit about the history and the setting. I hadn't gotten a whole lot into that in my prior studies of Esther, and I, of course, remember the story. I remember all of it. But there's some details in here I think we'll be able to pull out. We kind of step out of Scripture and look at kind of some of the historical context. Esther, the book's called Esther, but she's not mentioned until the second chapter. So it's not like right off the bat we're talking about Esther. You know, to your point, you got Mordecai a little bit before Esther in here, right? A lot of the book and the focus of the book is around the king. Who is the king that we're talking about in here? Xerxes or Ahasuerus. You know, we'll talk about those names a little bit, but a lot of the focus is on the king and what all happens in, I'm going to call it that culture. I don't know if that's the best word or not, but how the Persian kingdom was run and how the king operated and who he was and what he could or couldn't do and how people operated around him. I mean, that's a kind of a study in itself, and we'll get into some of that. And so I mentioned we kind of step back in time. So this is one of the same maps I've shown before, or not maps, the timelines I've shown before. And you see Xerxes on here. You don't see Ahasuerus, but you'll see that up at the top. After Darius is about, Darius was before him. And then this is a picture out of the book. And you've got marriage of Esther somewhere in the 480 range. And I think that's one of the key things just to remember, kind of 480-ish. That is before Nehemiah. So we just went through Nehemiah, and again, we're going back in time here to Esther. But this is after Ezra and all the things that happened with Zerubbabel returning, Ezra returning, completion and reconstruction of the temple, obviously before the walls were built. So this is kind of in that period in between, those last two books. I don't know why the Bible was organized that way. Well, it's not, in the chronological order, but that's what we have, and that's what we'll work with. So, from a historical context perspective, the book opens up with events during the reign of Ahasuerus, which was Xerxes. So, Ahasuerus was the Persian name, and as I understand, it's a transliteration of how you actually pronounce the real Persian name, which I'm not going to attempt. It's a bunch of consonants and a couple of vowels mixed in there. If anybody can pronounce that, I'd like to hear it. But that's the name that starts with a K is officially the Persian name, but the way you say that's transliteration. The way you actually say it would sound like Ahasuerus. I don't know how you get Ahasuerus out of something that starts with a K, but that's the way I understand that. Ahasuerus. Yeah, maybe it's the K is an A. I don't know. But the Greek name is Xerxes. And so if you step back and think about historical time period, and I'll show some maps a little bit later, but the Persian Empire predates the Greek Empire, and then you have the Romans thereafter, right? So at this point in time, the Persians are the world power. They are still, they are 2/3 of the world. If you look at the populated world in a map, they are 2/3 of the world. The Greeks are rising, and there will be a big story here around what happens with the Greeks and some battles and some fun like that that we'll talk about this week. Next week, I will probably bring in a video. I found a good video on YouTube that talks, it's probably about 20 minutes, and so we'll take probably 20 minutes of our time and watch a recreation of some of the battles that Xerxes was involved in around this time, kind of in between chapter 2 and chapter 3 of Esther. And so that's been helpful to me to kind of understand why some of the things that we read about in Esther might have happened. So sometimes you have to step back and look at the world history and kind of understand a little bit more about why did this really happen. So that's probably what we'll do next week. I'm still working on next week's stuff, but we'll consider that. All right. he ruled 485 to 465. We saw about 480. I mean, I'm not going to be super specific on years, as you all know, but that's about when Esther was married. So Xerxes comes into power. He's in power for a handful of years before Esther is the queen. So just kind of give you a little bit of perspective. She's not at the very beginning. She's not at the end. She's a few years after he becomes king. In the third year of his reign, according to history outside the Bible, this is where he assembles his team to have a big, war party planning, I guess. So they're planning to go invade Greece. And so, all right, then of course, he invades Greece somewhere around 480. Just got up here, it didn't go too well for him. He got the floor, he mopped the floor, like they cleaned up with him. He got sent home. So there's several historical accounts of this, but one said that about 2 million soldiers went with him, and eventually at the very end, about 5,000 came back. Different accounts, different numbers, some a couple hundred, 300,000-400,000, but no matter which way you look at it, he got whipped. Whatever that you probably shouldn't watch, but that is about Xerxes, Ahasuerus, the king who married Esther in the Bible. So this is kind of a little history, I think, that I found interesting. Like, first time you read through Esther, you're not going to pick all that up, but if you start stepping back and looking at the time period, it's interesting. I've got some stuff I want to read here. Just talk a little bit about the time period. I found some pretty good information. With all history, it's all in the perspective of who wrote it down, right? And as the Greeks took over the Persians, the Greeks destroyed a lot of what Persian records and history and perspective of life and everything would be, right? So you're going to have to consider that as I kind of read through some of the things that are said about Xerxes, his life, his rule, how he handled things. It's all going to be from someone else's perspective, not the Persians. And everybody thinks great of themselves and record wonderful things, but that's just how history works, right? So Xerxes was considered by most people a tyrant. I mean, that's how they would describe him. He was really infamous for this invasion of Greece that I have up on the screen. His reign was marred by multiple revolts, and it started the Achaemenid Empire's decline. So part of Persian, that empire, it started the decline, there with Xerxes. Xerxes wasn't the end of it, but it started like everything turned south pretty much when he was in power. He had a reputation for very harsh punishments of people, womanizing, and draining the Persian Empire's treasury and spending all their money. He built a lot of immense palaces. I'll have a picture of his palace here in a little bit, or what's left of it. Many other projects, and he really kind of left a mark on history in both Europe and in Asia because his area spanned all of that. So he got into power in a pretty controversial way. And this will be maybe a little hard to follow, but before Darius the Great, who is the leader that I mentioned on the timeline earlier, before his death, he named Xerxes or Ahasuerus as his successor. However, he wasn't the oldest son. And that's not what you do, right? You're supposed to pick your oldest son. He didn't pick his oldest son. Well, his half-brother, Darius' half-brother, Xerxes' half-brother, his name was Artaxerxes. He was born, obviously, before him, but he was born before his father Darius had become the king. So his older brother, half-brother, was born before Darius became the king. And so initially, obviously, his older brother claims the right to the throne. But Xerxes' mother Ahasuerus' mother, was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king that founded that entire empire. So Mama came in, and because Mama was a daughter of a king, father was a king, they skipped the half-brother who only had a father that was a king. His mother was pretty much a commoner. His mother was just a very common, average, everyday person. So that was controversial for him to even get into power. He was about probably 35 years old when he became king, just to kind of give you an idea of things. One of the first things he had to do when he came into the throne was deal with a revolt in Egypt. That all started kind of under his father's rule, Darius. But Darius died before he could kind of go squash the revolt, so Xerxes kind of picks up that problem and is going to have to go deal with it. He also, let's see here. Both Cyrus and Darius before him, they really honored Babylon quite a bit. They would say they were the king of Babylon. But Xerxes kind of changed that. He would say, I'm the king of the Medes and Persians, or Media and Persia. So there's just a little bit of a shift in perspective over the course of time. So during that time, he divided Babylon up into smaller provinces. He was raising taxes, and he had a lot of money, but he was raising taxes. And we'll see part of the story in here where he kind of gave everybody some tax relief. Well, he had been raising taxes on everybody. So most people don't like leaders that continue to raise taxes, just natural reaction. So, but that's what he was doing. Babylon was revolting a little bit, and he went and besieged the city, and just supposedly has destroyed one of the statues of Marduk, which was one of the Babylonian leaders. But you know, there's questions about that in history. His father, Xerxes' father, had already tried to invade Greece once, and was continuing to do so. So that was another thing Xerxes picked up. In addition to the revolt in Egypt, issues in Babylon, invasion of Greece started by his father, he was going to have to go finish that work and continue it. So he kind of comes in, I'll say mid-age, 35, and with some problems, and he's got to go deal with some things. So his father, when he invaded Greece, was defeated at a town called Marathon. You don't know what a marathon is, right? I've never run one, but it's that story, that historical Greek story of the one person running from one place to the next. That's kind of all in this time frame. So a lot of this, the book of Ruth Esther connects all this stuff together. And so his father got defeated at Marathon, and then there's big naval battles involved. I mean, massive amounts of ships, land armies involved, and Xerxes goes to Greece, and he gets whipped later too, and that creates. There's some other stories around that. There's movies made of it. Lots of other cool things. So if you're just a history buff, which I am not, but if you're a history buff, and you enjoy war and battles and war, powers and countries conflicting with each other, that this is like right there in prime stuff. Like if you're wanting to study that. So when he went to Greece, his entire naval fleet was basically crippled, done away with. Xerxes took him a certain distance in that battle, and then he went home and left one of his generals in charge. And while he was gone with his general in charge, that's when the rest of the people got killed, and they got kind of mopped up. So somewhere, I think, probably between chapter 2 and 3 in Esther is where he was gone and he came back. You'll see a little bit of a timeline here that I've got in a few pages. I hope we can get to that tonight. But somewhere in there is probably why Xerxes comes back. Some people are not too happy with him within his kingdom. He's got some financial pressures, all those types of things, because sustaining a very large army for a battle, when it doesn't go too well, that's expensive. And so that's kind of what's going on in the background. All right, little stories in here, I think, that help you get a feel for who this guy was. So to get his army ready for that Greek invasion, he conscripted a lot of labor and a lot of soldiers. He forced people to join the army. And there were 5 sons of one guy named Pythias, who was a governor. He was governor of the area. Had 5 sons, and they were all conscripted. And so the governor, Pythias, requested that his eldest son be allowed to remain as his heir. Well, why would you want to send all your 5 sons off to battle? What if they all get killed? Who's going to be my heir? That was kind of the situation. So what do you think Xerxes did?
In the battle.
Chopped them in half and set them on either side of the road as a marker. You don't mess with me, basically. Chop the guy in half, set him across on either side of the road, just as a reminder to anybody else who wanted to cross him. That's who Ahasuerus was. All right. So again, this is all Greek perspective, right? The Persian perspective, and there was no autobiography written by Xerxes. But he was also reported to be a womanizer. So we know Esther wasn't his first wife, right? Supposedly he pursued the wife of his brother and failed to woo her. So he had an affair with his brother's daughter. That's fun. During that time, supposedly, Xerxes he had like a big robe that his wife had made for him. She'd made this big robe, but his brother's daughter wanted it. And he knew that if he gave it to her, then she's going to find out, right? Like, she's walking around wearing the robe that you made for me, like actually made. And he eventually gave in and gave her the robe. So that's not normal stuff, right? So that's just an example of some of this that I found on him. When all that happened, I get all the names right. He basically, at the end of the day, he had his brother's wife, who, he was with their daughter. He basically had his brother's wife killed and mutilated. So, there's some stuff going on here in the family. He had a number of building projects that basically close to bankrupted the Persian Empire. And we'll see some pictures of that here in a little bit. I mentioned he'd gone to Greece and kind of got whipped, but even despite of that, they were still a major power. Like it didn't completely destroy the Persian Empire, but it was the beginning of their downfall. Like it was a massive defeat, but it didn't, quite end everything. At the end of his life, Xerxes was assassinated by one of his own advisors, which happens a lot back in that day, I guess. People around you didn't like you, and they're going to kind of get rid of you. That's what happened to him. And I think that's probably all I want to cover out of all that. So how does that set up Esther for you a little bit differently? Change your perspective, maybe.
That just does explain a little bit more fully why it was such a big deal for her to go to him without being asked. Fear if he was kind of headstrong.
He was that guy.
Yeah.
He was that guy. Most definitely. That helped me kind of better understand. Okay.
And Mordecai saved him.
One time. Yeah. We'll read about that. Yeah. So, it helps me better understand not only how Esther had to approach him or chose and got to get him in the right mood, can't quite go approach him, all that kind of stuff, but also how there's this air of nervousness, it seems, kind of around him with his advisors, people plotting, which Mordecai found out, right? There was somebody plotting to kill him, and
which, like you said, I mean, your biography or the tales are coming from a later version, so I mean, like anything, some things get exaggerated. How bad was he? That's the question I get.
Right.
When Mordecai actually saves him or whatever, so I don't know. It just kind of goes one way or goes the other. Which way is?
Yeah. That's why I prefaced it as Greek, history. I mean, they're going to burn all the books and records, I guess, when you take over.
Said something about
Vashti.
Vashti.
We were just saying, it makes me really proud of her.
Yeah, because they said that it's very possible that he only wanted her to be wearing the crown. Yeah, I've been trying to involve the people, and she just didn't want to do that.
She didn't want to be that person.
Yeah.
Who knows if the history is correct about brother's wife and daughter and all that other stuff? Then maybe there's some I don't want to be part of this anymore. I went out. Yeah, it's hard to say, but I think that history is helpful.
And then Esther is awful walking into it.
Yeah, which kind of stuck. Like, one of the things that I kind of question as I was rereading over this a little bit is like, did she really have a choice? When they went out looking for all the beautiful young ladies to kind of be in the harem for the king, like, did she have a choice to say, no, I'm not signing up for summer camp? Like, I don't know. The way I read it, it didn't look like she had much of a choice.
And as a Jew, I wondered, did that hurt her conscience? Was it hard for her to be a part of that, and even to be his wife? I don't know what all the understanding. I mean, some idea of what they thought about marriage, but like, did that hurt her conscience? Was it hard for her to? This is a pagan guy who's got many women. I mean, even if she wasn't a Jew, all those sharing your husband with all those women, it's just it's just hard to understand the thinking, or we don't really know how she felt about it, really. But
I think potentially there's some of the providence of God that shows up in that. Like, she's clearly,
yeah.
I mean, having to go, like, I don't know that she could have said no. Like, and it just seems to happen. It all happens.
It's also just interesting that, God obviously was looking over all of this, but he had her in a situation that, we would all say would be sinful, being married to him. So it's just interesting. I just found that interesting. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think about it.
Yeah. I have lots of questions about that. Like, I will not have answers on any of those questions. I will tell you that now. But like, I'm left with as many questions as answers, but again, the history helps me better understand a little bit more of what she might have been thinking and how she might have been interacting and the fear she might have had, or Vashti or Vashti, however you say that, the first wife there that's mentioned, the counselors that are around them, those that jockeying for position, those that are later a little upset with them plotting against him, Mordecai and some of his actions, just lots of stuff that just kind of makes you wonder. But you have to look for God in all this.
How David and Solomon actually, how their reigns were with wives, and
it didn't go too well for them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Kind of the time of the era. I mean, it's odd for us anyway.
Yep. All right, I think I added some pictures in here last minute. This is a relief of King Xerxes, estimated around 479 BC, kind of that time frame. It's still there. I guess somebody propped it back up. It looks like it might have a few bullet holes in it. Maybe they need to adjust to the left a little bit. But, that kind of is what he might have looked like, if you can kind of get anything from that. I like that he's got people walking around with an umbrella.
That's probably Haman.
That or some of the eunuchs, probably. Yeah, so I've seen several pictures of him like this, and of course that's a carving, but I've seen found a few paintings that he's got somebody holding an umbrella over. Of course, it's hot over there, I guess, and so you might want some shade, but like, this is the guy, like, king of the world, almost 2/3 of the world, and he's got all this money and power, and he's got people, walking around with a little umbrella. I don't know if he had anybody feeding him grapes, but I didn't see anything on that. Just kind of give a feel for the wealth. I mean, these are not like, dirt poor people. I think a lot of times we think about historical nations, and yeah, there was lots of poverty. Yeah, they didn't have air conditioning and soap, and all those things that we have today. But like, this is like a mosaic that was, somewhere from that time period, around that time period, not necessarily his, but around that time period. And you could see that there was some artistic ability. There was some, nice tile work, I guess. This is, you may have heard of the Gate of Nations. There's a picture of it from another angle in this book. This is one I found online. This was built by Xerxes. I'm sure he didn't do any of the work, but because later in his rule, kind of toward the end, when he went on a building spree, construction spree. So some of this stuff, and this is all stuff that's real, it's still there. I'm sure someone had a pile of rocks back up to make it look right. But here's another one. So this is, a relief from around 510 BC, which is a little bit before he was in power, but they had these people called immortals. So it was like a group within their army that were kind of like the special forces. They were the better trained, better fed, group of people. And so this is what some of the warriors would have looked like, that we'll see, in some of the battles here that happened. So they called them the immortals. All right, this is his house. Or what's left of it. So his palace was built later in his, not at the beginning, toward later, but like, who has something like that? Like this thing is huge. So very intricate, lots of money spent, lots of labor. I'm sure you probably had hundreds and thousands of people working on something like this.
Is this in present day Iran?
Yeah, I believe it would be Iran. Susa, which I believe to be in Iran. But again, his empire went from India all the way to Greece, down to Egypt, kind of that whole swath there. All right. A few more things. He likely chose Esther in his 7th year of reign, and somewhere around his 7th year, and that was after his invasion of Greece. That most likely, that's what it all looks like. So that will kind of piece all this together. That will help us understand a little bit more around how people reacted various times around him. So we have. You mentioned, I think, Dan, you mentioned earlier the plot earlier. So in chapter 2, we're going to see these guys, Bigthan and Teresh, plot to assassinate Xerxes. And the thought is that is possibly due to the unsuccessful war. So obviously there was a plot to kill him, but why would you want to go kill the king? Well, maybe because they weren't too happy with what just happened. He came back and got whipped. I mean, that's a thought.
A lot of family members didn't come back.
Yeah. It's also possibly why Haman offered 10,000 talents of silver to destroy the Jews. Like if Xerxes, kind of king of the world, right, had all this money to go build all this stuff, what does he need with 10,000 talents of silver? He probably had it falling out of his pockets, right? Well, if he'd gone through this war and spent all this money and just got whipped and everybody was destroyed, and the financial toll and strain of that battle and sustaining that army, maybe he needed some cash. Maybe he was cash poor.
He didn't get to keep the Greeks' money.
He didn't get it. He didn't get there. He got sent home, right? So you kind of think about, like, well, why could this have happened? Well, war is expensive, and you're having to. You had to send an army a long way, a big army a long way, lots of ships, lots of food, lots of supplies, and then nobody came home. Like, I don't know if I have no idea if the surviving family got anything out of that, but if so, there would have been a lot of, death benefits paid to someone. But it's possibly why that happened. All right, last thing I have on here, probably out of order, but like mentioned, he is described as a tyrant. So with that said, let's look at the like an outline of Esther. So over on the far right, you have the rough year, and so I look at these things, directional. But in chapter 1, he holds these banquets, and this banquet we believe to be kind of like a big long banquet. We'll talk about that, like 180 days, half a year worth of partying. But it's about his 30-year reign, and likely this is where he's bringing everybody together and getting ready to go to battle. He's like getting all his counselors together and planning what he wants to do. Big party. Chapter 2 is when Esther goes to Ahasuerus, but that is already 4 years later. So somewhere chapter 2, chapter 3 is when we think the battle probably happened, and then he comes back. And so there's a big gap here between probably chapter 1 and chapter 2, more than 2 and 3. But some bad stuff happened in there outside in world history there between the two. So I wanted to start with like the world history before we got into the book and kind of piece some of these things together. So I'm sure you all read this many times. But then you get into chapter 3, which would be the 12th year of reign. That's another 5 years. So you go from skip from 4 years to chapter 1 to 2, and another 5 years to get into chapter 3, and that's where Haman cast his lots. So after that, things progress pretty quickly in his year of reign. So the 12th and 13th year of his reign is where the majority of the story happens. And so just things just go south really fast, I guess, for a lot of people that are involved. So I'll refer back to this probably every week. I'll probably bring this back in. I may not bring it in on Sunday, but probably have it next week, just to kind of orient ourselves around what else happening here in the book. So Haman has his first decree there in chapter 3. They're planning for the annihilation of the Jews. Mordecai issues his decree, and we'll get into that story. That's all the way there in chapter 8. But from chapter 3:13 to 8:9, it's just a couple of months there, right? And then we get to the end. So I will cover chapters 1 through I think 8 over the next 3 weeks, and then when John flies back, he'll cover the last couple chapters. So again, we've got 4 weeks on about 10 chapters. So we're going to take our time working through this, and we'll have to bring some other things. And I'll appreciate all your comments in advance, because there's not a whole lot. Like we could probably have already read Esther twice already tonight if we wanted to, and we would have gotten the story, and we could have gone on to another book. But we're gonna kind of look at some of this a little bit more deeply. All right. We hit two little. I talked about maps. So at the time, and this is good, I like this map because it's really at the time of Esther, the Persian Empire around that time goes all the way from India, like the northwest corner of India, not all the way down to the bottom in India, the cold part of India, not the hot part. And it goes all the way over to Greece. And it goes down even into Egypt. So I mentioned earlier he had some rebellion in Egypt that he had to go deal with. Well, that's part of his empire. He had to go deal with it because it's part of his empire. This is a massive swath of territory. And so you just kind of step back and think about that, like how many countries that covers today, and the number of people and the rulers that are involved. Like this guy had all of this under his control. Here's another one, maybe a zoom out, like, of kind of the world around that time. This is not, you know, this is about 500 BC. So remember, I talked about Esther around 480-ish, right? So this is about the same time. You can kind of see the Persian Empire is right there in the middle, and everything else is kind of dispersed. Now, you're not going to see quantities of people here, but this is kind of a map of the known world at that time, 500 BC, of what people are where. All right, we will actually get into the book on Sunday. Thank you all. You're welcome. We took a red book shop time. Oh, you did?
Yeah.